Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining me for study 11 of our studies in Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And today we're looking at the so-called household codes. Typically in the New Testament letters, we have these clusters of instructions for wives, husbands, parents, children, masters, bondservants. And these are known as the household codes because, of course, in the ancient world, households were more than just nuclear families. They involved parents, they involved children, and also the servants who lived in the household. So often the house churches would have involved both the family plus the servants plus those who attended church in the household. And so it's not uncommon for us in these New Testament letters, as indeed in other ancient Near Eastern documents from the first century, the Greco-Roman world, to discover these household codes and instructions for them. So today we want to think about Paul's instructions to Christian wives and husbands, Christian parents and children, and Christian bondservants and masters. And I thought we'd start with the passage in reverse order because we want to spend most of our time talking about husbands and wives. That certainly is where Paul spends most of the time in this passage. So we're going to begin at the end, if you like, and start with the bondservants and their masters. I've spread, in terms of the annotated document, it's spread over 2 pages, so we'll just have to flick through from one page to the other as we go along. Trust you'll be able to follow me there. So we're going to be starting with the bondservants and masters. And immediately we do that, we'll see that as with children and parents, as we'll see in a moment, Paul has one primary command, and that is the command to obey. Now, bondservants here, Christian bondservants, are told to obey their earthly masters. The application of this really has to do with our workplace relationships. So how do we as Christians relate to those over us, those in authority over us at work? And the answer is obey them. Now notice that Paul doesn't just say obey. He has a number of qualifying comments that are made, which are very important to note. So we'll just notice these as we go along. First of all, they are to obey their masters with fear and trembling. Paul's point here is that we should exercise respect, that we should actually treat our earthly bosses with respect, recognizing the consequences of disobedience and the very real consequences that come from not obeying them in what is legitimate and legal and lawful and also Christian, as we'll see in a moment. So the obedience needs to be with fear and trembling. Notice also then with a sincere heart, says Paul, with a sincere heart, not by way of eye service, so not as a man pleaser. So with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, not by way of eye service, not as a people pleaser, but really how, as you would Christ and as a bondservant of Christ. So do you see Paul's point? Our obedience at the office in things that are legitimate is to be done from the heart, whether people are watching us or not, as unto the Lord, and as serving the Lord. Not serving people, but serving the Lord. We shouldn't be currying favor with those at work. We shouldn't be jockeying for position, trying to gain advantage, but really to be acting at work as those who are under the eye of Christ and who are serving Christ. And notice what Paul says, that in this we do the will of God from the heart. So what we do at work is part of how we keep God's will for our lives. A very striking statement, isn't it? Work takes on a whole new meaning as a Christian, because we recognize that our behavior towards those in authority over us in the office is part of how we do the will of God and how we serve Christ. We're rendering service with a good will, and there it is again, as to the Lord. So I guess we could sum this up as obey as to the Lord, as if we were serving the Lord. So that's quite all-embracing. Of course, the phrase as to the Lord means that we should never obey in anything that is contrary to God's will, anything that God would be disappointed or displeased by. So the obedience is only in those things which are moral and right and legal and upright, and things in which we as Christians are not compromising. If we are asked to do something at work which is contrary to God's will, then of course we must refuse to do so, although again with respect. There's something that we need to know here. Verse 8 says Paul, so we are to know that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or free. And this really takes us to the second part of the paragraph, which is Paul's word to masters. You notice that it says masters do the same to them. So can that mean that masters are to obey their bondservants? Well, of course not. So it has to refer to this idea of knowing that the good that we do with a view to what God gives as a reward. And so masters, in the same way, in the way we treat bondservants, now those who are under us, under our authority, perhaps someone working in our home or someone at the office who's under our authority, we are to treat them with the mind that we will receive back from the Lord what we give to others. So we should treat them in the way that we ourselves want to be treated, but also we should treat them in the way that is appropriate for those who have the eye of God upon them. That's what he means when he says, do the same to them. And what does that involve? Well, it means not threatening. So we shouldn't threaten people at the office. We shouldn't try and get the best out of them by threats and by an unhealthy or an ungodly kind of pressure put upon them, but rather knowing that we who are masters also have a master. Our master is in heaven. And notice that this master treats no one with any partiality. So we shouldn't show favoritism. If we have authority, we shouldn't show favoritism to one employee above another. We should treat everybody in the same way as we ourselves would like to be treated. Of course, that doesn't undo the authority of the master. The master still has authority, just as the bondservant has to obey. But Paul's point is that the fact that we are Christians should completely and radically change the way we deal with those over us in authority or those under our authority. So that's the first of the house codes, obey as to the Lord, and of course for the masters, treat those under you with respect, I think is the way we would say it. In other words, treat them in a way that is appropriate for those who have to give an account to God. Doesn't mean that we can't give them instructions. It does mean that the way we treat people is with the eye of God upon us. So that's the first thing to notice. Now let's move secondly to children and parents. This is a much shorter section in 6:1 through to 4. Again, Paul begins with the children. So in all of these household codes, he begins with the one who is to show either obedience or submission in the case of wives. Children, he says, obey your parents, and notice this in the Lord. So the verb is obey, just as with masters, the verb with bondservants, the verb was obey. So there's a link there between those two, same verb. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Now, this is a radical challenge to modern parenting, where parents seek to be friends rather than parents very often, and where the idea of obedience has almost gone out of fashion. Now, there's a way of doing this which is wrong, of course. So no bullying is permitted. No, this is not a license for parents to do what they like or bully their kids. In fact, this phrase, obey your parents in the Lord, gives the children the right of discretion. Now, as if parents expect anything from their children, which is not godly, is not in the Lord, then the children really should not obey. You'll have often heard me say in preaching that one of the most important things we can teach our children is not just to say yes, but also to say no. There are times when our kids need to say no. And Paul then gives the motivation for children, and I love the way Paul treats children with responsibility. He addresses them, calling upon them to obey parents. He doesn't tell the parents, tell your children to obey them, you. He tells the children, so obviously these are children of age and of discretion, children, obey your parents, And then he cites from the commandment, honor your father and your mother, that it may go well with you and you may live long in the land. In other words, God's order, the well-being of society, which is what the commandments are all about, is built around the home. And in the home, a proper, legitimate obedience is learned, which is a very important life skill for the rest of life. I mean, you can't go to work and practice godly obedience in work if you've not learned that in the home. But at the same time, in the Lord means that children are also to be taught an independent mind and discretion, really, in what they and how they will respond. You'll remember that in Ephesians, Paul has already spoken about fathers. So we saw that Paul bowed the knee before God, from whom the whole family, this is 3 verse 14, or all fatherhood derives its name. So we've already had a reference to fatherhood in the letter. And it's striking, isn't it, that Paul addresses not parents here, but he doesn't say parents don't provoke your children to anger. He says fathers don't provoke your children to anger. So there was obviously something going on in Ephesus around fathers and children that Paul was deeply concerned about. But I think the principle applies more generally to parents. So single parents, if there's a father and a mother in the family, whatever it happens to be, just a mum, just a dad, the principle is that as we parent our children, we should not provoke them to anger. Now, it's worth thinking about that. How do we provoke our children to anger? Well, I think the first thing is if anything unfair is done. Children hate unfairness. They hate injustice. I think also we should avoid being unreasonable. Trying my best to improve my handwriting for these things. We should try to not be unreasonable. Unfairness and not being reasonable really drives kids nuts. And so Paul says that as parents, particularly as fathers, we should not provoke our children in this way. But rather than provoking them, we should bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. So in these two groups that we've seen so far, Paul is talking about parents and children, bondservants and masters, and in both cases the verb is obey. Children, obey your parents, bondservants, obey your masters. But there are constraints placed, and the command is not only to the children or the bondservants, but also to the parents, fathers in particular, and to the masters. Because God wants relationships to work, and so relationships are two-way things. Now we come to wives and husbands. This is the longest section, and here it's very interesting to note that Paul's command to wives is that they should submit to their own husbands. Now we need to think this through a little bit, because the S word, submit, is a word that's highly misunderstood. It's often equated with obedience, but we've seen already that Paul has the word obey, and he could have put that word in here. Later on, he talks about the fact that wives should respect their husbands. So for wives towards husbands, the two words that Paul uses are submission and respect. Now, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Saviour. Now, as the church, here's the key, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. That is, in everything which is godly and right. We're going to park that for the moment and talk about the husbands, because I think we'll better understand submission if we understand what Paul says to the husbands. In this section, Paul speaks to the husbands, and here the command is to love as Christ loved the church. So again, Christ and his example, the gospel relationship, is the model. And we see that this love that the husband is to do is for the good of his wife. And in fact, it's sacrificial. So Christ gave himself up for her. So we have this phrase that Christ gave himself up for her. Husbands, love your wife means give yourself up for her. So if you like, lay down your life for her. That's what it means to love. And that, by the way, is what headship means. So headship here, in Paul's teaching, is loving, initiative-taking, sacrificial service. It's not headship like the Gentiles, lording it over. Jesus will have nothing to do with that. Paul will have nothing to do with that. And in fact, if you look at this entire section, you'll notice that everything that the husband is to do in love and in sacrificial service for his wife is to take the initiative for her good so that she might benefit. It's service sacrificially for the good of the other person, to the point of laying down my life for her. That's what it means to be the head. To be the head of my home means to serve my wife, particularly in a way that I lay down my life for her. I give up my rights. I don't stand on my rights. I'm not asserting myself. I'm not bullying or domineering. I mean, that is not a Christian way to behave. Bullying is unchristian. A domineering attitude is unchristian. Husbands are to lead, that is, they are to be the head of the home, according to the gifts that God has given them. It's not so much a question of what function they perform, who looks after the checkbook. It's no good if a husband wastes money and he doesn't know how to manage money, and his wife's an accountant, that he should say, I'm the husband, I must handle the money. That's just a foolish way of working. The issue isn't here about task. The issue is about role, and the husband is the head of the home insofar as he is to take the initiative in serving his wife. Now, in that context, what does submission mean? Well, submission means allow your husband to serve you. It means don't be independent, but rather allow your husband, as a wife, allow your husband to serve you in the way that God expects him to serve you. Obviously, there is relationship here, there is quid pro quo, there's give and take. If I can think about my relationship with Alison and the way we work, we discuss things, we don't do things that one or the other is against. It's a partnership, really. In the end, I'm responsible as the head of the family. Alison, who's very competent and capable in her own right, at times has to step back and allow me to do my thing, to serve, to lead with sacrifice. So what Paul is saying to women is, don't be independent of your husbands. Allow them to serve, just as Christ is to serve us. And there's a great gospel thing here. Remember what Paul says? This is the mystery which is profound. I'm talking about Christ and the church. Here's the thing. Christ is the head of the church by serving it, and indeed by laying down its life. Now imagine if we said, thank you very much, Jesus, for your service, but we're quite capable of serving ourselves. We want to be independent of you. Do you see, we can't be saved in that way. The only way you and I can be saved is if we allow Christ to serve us by laying down his life for us. And so it is in this context here of husbands and wives, that wives are to submit to their husbands as the church does to Christ, following the lead, in conversation, as an equal partner with a different role, but at the same time not being independent, but allowing, receiving the service, if you like, for your good. Just as we as Christians are to receive the service of Christ for our eternal good, wives are encouraged to receive the service of their husbands for their good, and to always treat their husbands with respect. There's nothing worse than a situation where if you're sitting in company and you're listening to a man and a woman talking to each other, and it becomes very clear from their conversation to each other, the husband and the wife that is, that she is disrespectful to him, she doesn't respect him, and he doesn't respect her, and bullies her and shuts her up and interrupts her, or she's just obviously not respectful. That is not a model of Christian home. Now, just one final thing to say. In all of these household codes, Paul's deep concern is that the gospel should be portrayed before the watching world in Ephesus in a way which highlights how different the Christian's life is from the life of the pagans. So the way Christian husbands and wives behaved had to be different from the pagan way. The way Christian parents and children behave, different from the pagan way. The way Christian masters and slaves or bondservants behaved, different from the pagan way, so that the whole gospel might be made attractive to the watching world. Well, I hope you found that helpful, and trust that you'll enjoy this study and your group discussions. And if there are any questions or things around this that you need clarity about, please don't hesitate to let me know via your group leader, and I'll be happy to give you as much information as I can. Thanks for watching.